Your book makes the case for Abraham Lincoln being, in essence, a transatlantic figure who was a force for liberal democracy abroad. Uh, how so?
Lincoln is absolutely an inspirational figure, not just in the United States, but around the world, and one that endures to this day. What I found fascinating in researching this book isn't just the 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 ripples that he, an example, set forward that carried forward, but how it was his reputation for reconciliation. Um, a leadership that embodied reconciliation is that what made him most inspirational to people overseas. And you see it in moments like the Treaty of Versailles negotiations after World War One, where all three of the so-called big three each have deeply personal relationships with Lincoln, from Wilson being a son of the Confederacy to George Clemenceau, the French prime minister, having been a reporter covering Reconstruction, to David Lloyd George growing up with a portrait of Lincoln over his mantelpiece in Wales. And that just gives you a sense of the resonance of Abraham Lincoln, and the sense that what his contemporaries in the following generations believed that made him really great was his willingness to reach a hand out to lift up his defeated enemies once they accepted defeat. And that essential prescription of Lincoln's vision for winning the peace, which identifies unconditional surrender followed by a magnanimous peace, was so unusual that it carried his reputation forward, and his vision was ultimately vindicated. But he is not just an American hero, although he is that. In some ways, he's the archetypal American hero in politics. He is somebody whose example has inspired generations around the world, including, as I note, a disproportionate number of Nobel Peace Prize winners who find in Lincoln's example of reconciling leadership a model that they have tried to apply in their own lives in their own countries.
You call Generals Lucius Clay and Douglas MacArthur grandchildren of the Civil War generation, and focused on building strong institutions in Europe and Japan after World War II. What might emerging democracy nations today learn from them building strong institutions?
The example, good occupations are rare, and part of what motivated me to write this book is the question of how one wins the peace. It is difficult, to say the least, but I do think America did it well with its allies after the Second World War. You mentioned Lucius Clay and Douglas MacArthur, and I profile them in each chapter, and each of them have a slightly different spin on the ball that's appropriate to the cultures they're interacting with. And as you think about why the occupations of Germany and Japan, particularly after the Second World War, worked, I think you have to say that culture was a factor. One of the horrors of the Third Reich and Nazi Germany, and talking to German friends of my generation, is that a nation that prided itself on being so civilized, the birthplace of Goethe and Beethoven and Mozart, could descend into barbarism so relatively quickly. And that, I think, is a cautionary tale about, among other things, the dangers of tribalism in politics and ideology. As Václav Havel once said, ideology gives people the illusion of dignity and morals while making it easier to part with them. And that's why I, as a card-carrying centrist, tends to distrust the absolute imposition of ideology. And American history makes very clear itself the danger of tribal politics. So I think the fact but Germany had a culture to draw on. It had a civic culture. It had a culture to draw upon, from which the Nazis were an aberration. Japan had been Lincoln had been a figure who was venerated in Japan before the Second World War, during their period of outreach and engagement. His life was celebrated, taught in public schools, and that provided MacArthur a toehold to introduce Lincoln as an exemplar of how to become a more democratic country, which was aided by the fact that he kept the emperor in place. That was highly unusual. That was about him steering the occupation of Japan and toward its culture. He said, look, if we get rid of the emperor, it will be exponentially harder to win the peace. So instead, he co-opted the emperor to the extent that the emperor admitted to his people that he was not a descendant of the sun god. The Constitution was rewritten. But he was building on things that had credibility within Japanese culture. And of course, the ultimate exemplar was solidified certainly by the Marshall Plan in the case of Europe, where it's the opposite of reparations, right? It's an investment in peace. And America not only rebuilds its allies, but also its one-time enemies as a bulwark against communism. And Lucius Clay is key in that. And it's Lucius Clay who says the quote that began the book over a decade ago, when it was sort of a twinkle in my eye, so to speak, which was somebody asked him what guided his decisions. And he said, I tried to think what Abraham Lincoln would have done for the South if he had lived, which I think speaks to the way that the past can inform the present and the future, and this dance, which characterizes the best speeches, but also the best policies. So yes, culture does matter in winning a peace and establishing a liberal democracy. But I think the example of investment and a certain degree of civic patience can help. There has to be political reform and economic investment and cultural reintegration. All those forces, focusing on any one, I think, is mistaken. And that's one thing that Lincoln understood. I mean, the way that he worked with Republicans in Congress in the darkest days of the war through Transcontinental Railroad, land grant colleges, the Homestead Act, to create a structure of economic investment to move the nation's attention westward. I think that was brilliant and has gotten too little appreciation for the kind of policy structures that could be put in place to appeal to people's rational economic self-interest, to create a sense of shared investment after the war.
I know that you also wrote that Lincoln's example offered us a path away from polarization. So how does Lincoln help us with that?
Well, it's ironic as well, obviously, because the mere fact of Lincoln's election was enough to spur secession. I mean, he was not viewed as a legitimate president. There was an insurrection in effect once he was elected. But I think that's where, once again, I think the study of history can help us. As Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat, but sometimes it rhymes. And so when we listen from the rhymes, I think they're awfully useful. First of all, Lincoln and Washington, for that matter, are seen as our greatest presidents, but they were hated by people in their times. When we see the dangers of the appeals to tribal politics that create the preconditions for civil war in Lincoln's case, which is a belief that losing an election was akin to, losing one's identity. That was what occurred in the run-up to the Civil War, and the violence simply hastened the polarization, despite Lincoln's best intentions, despite his attempts to reason together to say, look, I'm not trying to end slavery, I'm trying to stop slavery's expansion. I mean, he didn't even believe that the president had the power to end slavery absent a war. But of course, the Confederacy ended up creating the thing it feared most, as we sometimes do in life. And so I think that it's Lincoln's leadership that offers us the greatest example, not just his policies, but part of the thesis of the book is a reminder that politics and policies are a reflection of a person's principles that are usually a reflection of their personality, something as basic as that. And when you look at the essential alloys of Lincoln's personality, I see an absence of malice. I see somebody who was defined by empathy and honesty and humor and humility, and knew how to deploy those qualities as a way of disarming opponents and building bridges, citing scripture and humor and logic, not ever feeling that, in a second inaugural address, he's not going to let the create any sense of moral equivalence between the North and the South, but he's not going to let the North rest easy with a sense of moral superiority, because we were all part of the economy that perpetuated slavery. In the North, it may have been, negotiations around the ratification of the Constitution, but more importantly, buying cotton, buying rice. And Lincoln is incredibly disciplined at this. He says, look, we are just what they would be if we were in their position. He said, I'm not anti-South, I'm anti-secession, I'm anti-slavery. And he believed in empathizing with people as a means of reasoning with them. That's a powerful example. He didn't demonize people he disagreed with, even in the middle of a civil war. That's an example we could stand to learn from. And yet he was not naive at all. Ultimately, the kind of leadership that Lincoln represented as a reconciler in a time of radicals and reactionaries I think the key is that he combined moderation with moral courage. And we don't see that enough, it seems to me. He had the moral courage to understand that slavery was a core contradiction to the American ideal, the American identity. And one of the things he hated about slavery, and especially the arguments he confronted with Stephen Douglas, which sort of affected a certain apathy towards slavery. He said, "You are depriving our nation of our rightful moral example upon the world." But he also was a man of moderate temperament. He was not a zealot. He was not an extremist in any way. He did believe in building bridges, and indeed was criticized by the abolitionists of his time for not being radical enough. As Frederick Douglass said, seen from an abolitionist perspective, he could be seen as tardy, cool, and indifferent. But seen from the perspective of a politician who was required to consult the sentiments of his fellow citizens, he was zealous, determined, and radical. Lincoln had in mind how to achieve sustainable change. And I think that's what that combination of moderation and moral courage does. And that's what the kind of leadership I think we need now. Leadership focused on reconciliation, on achieving sustainable change, on reuniting us as a nation. And it will not solve all our problems, certainly not overnight. It's not that we're going to find another Lincoln, but we can look to people of a similar spirit and remember the other great takeaway from American history, which seems clear to this day to me, which is that character is ultimately the indispensable quality in a president. And I think Lincoln reminds us of that as well.